Welcome back. Breaking news on the war between Russia and Ukraine. A U.S. official tells CBS News that Ukraine has agreed to a U.S.-backed peace proposal with only minor details left to sort out. The specifics, though, are still unclear. But we are learning President Volodymyr Zelensky could travel to the United States for final touches as early as this week. I want to bring in Robert Murrett, Deputy Director of the Syracuse University Institute for Security Policy and Law. Robert, thank you for joining us on 24/7 today. With Ukraine apparently in agreement, what do you think it will take for Russia to sign off on this proposal?
And that is probably the most important question we have at this point. It's really encouraging based on what's happened in Geneva and also in Abu Dhabi just in the last several days. However, what the Kremlin has to say about it after the agreement that apparently has been reached between the United States and Ukraine will be absolutely critical. So look forward to get some word on that here, hopefully in the next few days. And what, as you know, is a fast-moving story.
Yeah, and what are the biggest challenges in getting this deal done, given how the terms differ from what was proposed during, I should say, the Trump and Putin summit just a few months ago?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of key elements. The biggest one, of course, is security guarantees, as you know, for the Ukrainians, and also a couple other of the things pertaining to territory and what the front lines would look like, especially for Donetsk, that one part of the so-called the Donbass, which is not occupied by the Russians yet. They seem to be agreeing to the current forward lines they've got in the other two provinces, Kherson and Zaporizhia, so that part of the geography looks fairly straightforward. But I think the big resistance that'll probably come out of the Kremlin will have to do with some of what they always describe as the underlying conditions, which is security guarantees for Ukraine, but some way precluding them from joining the NATO alliance, and also some ambiguous language regarding their joining the European Union.
Yeah. And Robert, as we said, we know a U.S. official says that Ukraine has agreed to this peace proposal. But from your experience, your expertise, what do you think will happen if Russia says no?
I think hopefully it would result in some additional pressure from the European partners and also the United States and Canada, which has been very straightforward. And we would have to have an understanding among all of us that we needed to continue to have significant pressure on the Kremlin leadership to somehow force them to the table and have an agreement that would be acceptable to the key stakeholders, all the key stakeholders, not in the least the Ukrainians, but also the European nations and the North American stakeholders for carrying this forward and having a lasting peace agreement that's actually going to stand the test of time.
And we know Russia has seen a lot of casualties in this war as well. I think it's important to mention that. And yet we know President Vladimir Putin has just continued to go on and has refused basically to come to the table to speak with President Zelensky. Do you think there's any amount of pressure at this point that could be put on Russia? You think of it, the nation has seen a lot of sanctions so far, and that hasn't made a difference.
Yeah, just, kind of step back, and that's a great point. I mean, Russia has a lot of problems, and they certainly have a tolerance for high casualties. Thousands and thousands are killed in action on a regular basis, which Western countries and also Ukraine would not tolerate. And just, the economic, demographic, social problems that Russia has. And I don't think there's any question that any reasonable person would conclude it would be very much in their interest and not be an international pariah anymore, and to end this conflict so they could rejoin the family of nations for the good of their own people. However, the Kremlin leadership just has this thing about Ukraine, and hopefully they'll be able to come off that, and additional pressure, if we can put it on them, will hopefully achieve that result.
Yeah. Robert Murrett, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your insight.
The White House is touting what it calls tremendous progress in the effort to stop Russia's nearly 4-year assault against Ukraine. A U.S. official told CBS News Ukraine's government has agreed to a peace proposal with only minor details left to be sorted out. But there has been no immediate reaction from Russia. U.S. officials and diplomatic sources tell us that Army Secretary Jan Driscoll is in Abu Dhabi today, meeting with Russian officials. We're also told a delegation from Ukraine is there and has been talking to Driscoll and his team. Ukraine's national security advisor voiced optimism that President Volodymyr Zelensky could travel to the U.S. before the end of this month to finalize an agreement. CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer has more from our London bureau.
Everyone involved in the negotiations for this peace deal is making positive noises, except, that is, for the Russians. Ukraine has signaled its support. The Europeans are firmly behind Ukraine. And White House spokeswoman Caroline Leavitt tweeted that there has been tremendous progress. But what the actual terms of the deal are, nobody knows at this stage. The original proposal came on the weekend. It was a 24-point plan that appeared to be a win for Russia and a capitulation for Ukraine. Crucially, it was going to demand that Ukraine give up 20% of its land, most of it occupied by Russia currently, but also some that Ukraine is still successfully defending. The proposal also stimulated that Ukraine would reduce the size of its armed forces by about a third and forfeit the right to join NATO. Also, the security guarantees for Ukraine in the event that Russia attacked again were pretty squishy. There were no promises in that deal that the U.S., for example, would intervene or help. European leaders weren't impressed. They pushed back on Ukraine's behalf. And there is a counter-proposal now public. It's lost the clause on Ukraine never joining NATO and also the shrinking of its military. But we just don't know whether that proposal has been incorporated into the version of the agreement that's currently on the table. Russia is not sounding overjoyed about all this, but for the moment is just saying it hasn't received anything official to accept or reject. So the next step may well be a visit by President Zelensky to the White House. Could be quite soon, before the end of the month, to iron out details with President Trump on a final version. And then the agreement will have to be put to the Russians. And then anything could happen, including a flat-out rejection. We'll just have to wait and see. Back to you.
Liz Palmer, thank you. For more on this proposed peace deal, CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd joins us from our Washington bureau. I mean, to echo Liz's point, anything can happen, including a flat-out rejection. Ukraine not being allowed to join NATO has been a sticking point for Russia to stop its invasion. What are the next steps to take all sides to agree to a deal?
Well, Lindsay, we should certainly expect this to continue playing out publicly, as President Trump is very focused on the public rhetoric coming out of the White House, as well as what the Ukrainians, Europeans, and even the Russians are saying as he seeks to end the war. But what's happening behind closed doors is more important. We should expect the United States to continue to play a mediator role and to take the current draft of the proposal, which Ukraine has now agreed to. It's really their counter-proposal to what we now understand was largely a Russian-backed 28-point proposal. But for the United States to take that back to the Russians and to try to get to a point of convergence between the 28-point proposal and the now 19-point proposal. So I would expect extensive diplomacy over the next few days, including by a range of different officials from the Trump administration. We've seen Dan Driscoll, the Secretary of the Army, involved, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Special Envoy Witkoff and Jared Kushner. So the president is clearly deploying the full team to try to get to a deal.
Okay, so you just mentioned Kushner, Witkoff. They helped broker the Gaza peace deal. And you also talked about the importance of the behind closed doors diplomacy. We know Army Secretary Driscoll has been leading the talks. Why has he been seemingly the point person?
Well, I think there's two different pieces of this. There is ensuring that individuals who are known to have the president's ear and a close relationship with the president to be present. That's a Witkoff-Kushner piece of this. And at the same time, you do need subject matter experts to work on things like military concessions and NATO membership and more technical aspects of the deal. So I actually do think it's smart that various players are involved in these negotiations. Putin is going to need to know that any proposal that is presented to him has the backing of the U.S. president. At the same time, both parties are going to need to engage on the technical details with mediators that understand what they're discussing, whether it's the military aspects of the deal, frozen Russian assets. We could see Secretary Bessent involved, and more technical details.
All right, Sam Vinograd, thank you.
Thanks.
CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang is here with more. Weijia, what are we hearing from the administration about this?
Well, both the U.S. and Ukraine are signaling a lot of optimism after days of intense negotiations, including a very high-level talk in Geneva. And today, we know that President Trump just spoke at that ceremony for those turkeys, and he said that he thought he was very close to reaching a final deal. He also signaled that he thought even though it's not done yet, that the teams are getting there. And we also heard from the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, in what I should say is a very carefully worded and carefully crafted statement. She said, over the past week, the U.S. has made tremendous progress towards a peace deal by bringing both Ukraine and Russia to the table. There are a few delicate but not insurmountable details that must be sorted out. And so even though a U.S. official did tell CBS News that the Ukrainians accepted the deal, the Ukrainians are also using softer language, stating that they came to an understanding of what will be in the updated plan. Now, remember, the original plan had 28 points that received a lot of criticism from Democrats and Republicans alike, who said Russia did not give any concessions in the agreement, and it was Ukraine that had to give up a lot, even accusing the administration of working directly with Moscow and asking whether this document was written in Russia and whether the Russians were the ones who actually wrote it. But the White House has completely pushed back on that, saying this was a U.S.-authored agreement, and they continue to work off of that to get closer. But, Lindsay, at this hour, nothing has been finalized yet.
Russia started all the killing in Ukraine. It didn't have to, but it did. More than 10,000 Ukrainian civilians have died as a result. The number of Ukrainian military wounded and dead, many multiples of that. Infrastructure across Ukraine is destroyed or in some state of barely functioning rubble. Evidence of Russian war crimes, substantial. Russian war dead and wounded total by many accounts more than 1 million, yet Russia's territorial gains are a fraction of what they imagined when they invaded in February 2022. Ukraine, though heavily battered, is willing to fight on, but the prospect of ejecting the Russian army, always dim, has grown a bit more bleak in this, the fourth winter of war. That, then, is the backdrop for an aggressive White House push to end this conflict. The Ukrainians are managing to absorb that pressure as best they can and have redrafted, quite probably with the assistance of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, what was presented to them last week. And this morning dawned with a U.S. official saying the Ukrainians had signed on to a deal. Then the White House said not quite, that there were delicate details, that's a quote, still to be worked out. Late this afternoon, the president posted on social media that negotiations with Moscow and Kyiv were intensifying, and with that, the very real possibility of an agreement sufficiently detailed to warrant a summit of some kind between Trump, Russian President Putin, and Ukrainian President Zelensky. Moscow today, though, has been largely silent, a potentially ominous sign. This initiative, in other words, could smash, metaphorically, on the rocks of Russian diplomatic intransigence. But the White House is pressing. What is unclear is how hard and in how many directions. Kyiv has felt the pressure. Is Moscow? Joining us now from the White House, Jennifer Jacobs. Jennifer, this story moves by the hour. What can you tell us?
The president is telling us tonight that there are very few disagreements that are still in place, that there is positive forward movement, that they haven't fully reached everything, but that they are working on a final plan. So the president is dispatching one top advisor over to Moscow to go meet with President Putin over in Moscow, and that's Steve Witkoff, his special envoy, Steve Witkoff. And then he's sending another advisor, Dan Driscoll, that's the Secretary of the Army, who's a good friend of J.D. Vance. They went to Yale Law School together. Dan Driscoll is Secretary of the Army, a very insider advisor to this White House. So they're sending him to go meet with the Ukrainians, and that's where the latest is on that front.
And the point about Moscow's relative silence today should be considered seriously, in that if Moscow doesn't agree and the Ukrainians do, we still don't have a deal.
Right. So Steve Witkoff is the most inner circle of them all. The president has signaled today that the people who are key advisors to this are the chief of staff, Susie Wiles, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, J.D. Vance, and then you've got Marco Rubio. Now, the Ukrainians would like to send President Zelensky here to meet with President Trump, including this week during the Thanksgiving holidays. The president is telling us tonight that he doesn't want to do that. Zelensky wants to have a face-to-face with President Trump to make sure that this deal isn't too slanted. And the president is saying absolutely not meeting with with Putin or Zelensky until you guys have a final deal to end this war.
Jennifer Jacobs, North Lawn of the White House, thank you so very much. Joining me now, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor. Ambassador Taylor, you've been with us many times. Help my audience understand where we are right now, how to read the various tea leaves and representations going on.
Major, I think you've said it out right. That is, the Americans and the Ukrainians and the Europeans and probably the Brits seem to be aligned. Okay. They seem to be on board with this new proposal. This is a rejection of that 28-point proposal that was clearly written by the Russians and leaked by the Russians.
And lopsidedly advantageous.
Lopsidedly advantageous to the Russians. Zero surprise. So this one is much better. It took input, and I think you said it right, Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Rubio, pulled in input from the Ukrainians for the first time, seriously, and the Europeans. And it's come up with a shorter, smaller one, 18 or 19 points that are much better focused and much more likely to succeed.
So this 28 plan, advantageous to the Russians, was done in cooperation with Steve Witkoff and the Russian government. Steve Witkoff's going back to Moscow. What does that mean? One
hopes that Secretary Rubio has been able to corral the various pieces, and one hopes that both Witkoff and Driscoll, the Army Secretary, are now on board with this 19-point proposal, and that Witkoff is taking that 19-point proposal that's almost agreed by the Ukrainians and supported by the Europeans to Moscow to see if he can get. I hope he'll be pushing his buddy Putin to agree.
And it's clear to you, Ambassador Taylor, that what the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, we should remind ourselves Marco Rubio has both jobs, achieved here is not done freelancing. He is not working outside of the authority of the president. The president is clearly okay with it because this is where the negotiations now stand. So that revision, engineered quite probably by the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, has to be at some level reflective of what Trump is okay with.
I would assume so, too.
And Putin better assume that.
And Putin should assume that as well. And I'm sure that Witkoff will make that clear to Putin.
Okay.
That he needs to, this is the proposal, and can you sign on?
Do you, based on your interactions with the Russians, have any expectation that we're going to get a definitive answer anytime soon?
No. Putin is not interested in this. He's not interested in ending this war.
And he's interested in playing for time, as he always has been.
He's playing for time. He grinds through both Russian soldiers as well as the front line, making little progress, very little progress, losing 1,000 soldiers a day. But he doesn't care about that. He is after Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And the president raised the prospect of, if this deal is sufficiently detailed and finalized, we might have all three of them together. That certainly sounds aspirational at this moment.
Sounds aspirational. It does. The Europeans are going to be interested in that kind of a meeting. The Europeans will like to join that. They would like to be there, too. They've got a lot at stake. They're paying a lot of the bills. Their security is right on the line. If the Russians keep coming, they're threatened. So the Europeans would like to be there. They've got strong views about this.
Let's go back to a record you and I play frequently on the show, which is the what about sanctions against Russia record. It's still there. It's ready to be, the needle can be laid right upon it by the President of the United States. Is that still part of the backdrop for the conversations Witkoff has to have with Putin?
It has to be. It has to be. There needs to be pressure on Putin. Right now, there's not. There's some pressure. I mean, the president, to his credit, put the sanctions on the top two Russian oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, and they provide a lot of the income, of the revenue.
And there are some data, I always confuse that, indicating some softening of the Russian economy, which is an underlying pressure point that Putin cannot ignore forever.
Absolutely right. It is softening. and the revenues, which is the key thing. You're trying to squeeze off revenues that the Russians get from the sale of oil and gas to fund the war. And if they can squeeze that down, that's more pressure on Putin. But it's in addition to the sanctions, you need the weapons. So President Trump, if he really wants to put pressure on Putin to come to the table, if Witkoff should have this in his pocket, can give the Ukrainians tomahawks.
Give my audience a way to process whatever comes at them in terms of headlines the next 48 hours.
One question is going to be, will President Trump meet with President Zelensky? Sounds like he's saying he wants to wait until this is farther down the line, that it's more cooked before he actually meets with him. But it is going to be very important to see what Witkoff puts pressure, what kind of pressure he puts on.
Meaning, what does Witkoff say in the aftermath of that meeting, and what does Putin in Moscow say after that?
Exactly right.
Ambassador William Taylor, always brilliant. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Major.
Now let's go to CBS News reporter Erica Brown at the White House. Erica, what are we hearing from President Trump about the next steps for these peace talks?
Well, Lindsay, right now the White House is touting what they're calling tremendous progress towards this peace plan to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, but it is with what appears to be some measured and cautious optimism. Earlier today, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said that there were still some delicate but not insurmountable details that still needed to be worked out with further talks between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. And President Trump took to Truth Social, saying that he was deploying top officials for those further talks, including a special envoy Steve Witkoff headed to Moscow to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and Army Secretary Dan Driscoll meeting with Ukrainian officials. And that comes after Secretary Driscoll also met with Russian officials, according to sources in Abu Dhabi. Now, as you noted earlier there, President Trump said that his original 28-point plan had been fine-tuned. That, of course, comes after it received some criticism from European officials and even some lawmakers here in Washington, pushing back on some of the concessions that Ukraine would be forced to make, including cutting the size of its military and abandoning efforts to join NATO. But the president said that that initial plan had been fine-tuned to include input from both sides. The president also said that he looks forward to meeting with Zelensky and Putin, but only after the deal has been finalized or when it's in its very final stages. Lindsay?
Erica Brown, thank you. President Trump wrote in part on Truth Social, quote, "Over the past week, my team has made tremendous progress with respect to ending the war between Russia and Ukraine." He adds the original 28-point peace plan, which was drafted by the United States, has been fine-tuned with additional input from both sides, and there are only a few remaining points of disagreement. While this is happening, Putin remains on the offensive. The Russian military launched strikes on the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv overnight, killing at least 7 people. Ian Bremmer joins us now. He's the president and founder of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Ian, thanks for being here. Is there anything different about this moment?
Well, you've had a lot of negotiations, but honestly, we're not much closer to a ceasefire because the Russians and the Americans can agree on a deal. The Ukrainians and the Americans can agree on a deal, but those deals don't overlap. They are not compatible. And Russia is not prepared to accept anything close to what the Ukrainians are capable of putting on the table.
Is there any pressure on Vladimir Putin to cut a deal right now? Hasn't his plan the whole time been to play the long game, try and break Ukraine down over time?
Yes and yes. That has been his plan, and there is pressure. There's been over 1 million Russian casualties in this war. And the war is certainly impacting the economy. We are starting to see budgetary difficulties, growth slowing down, revenues really taking a hit. But this isn't going to prevent the Russians from feeling like they can continue to throw everything they have at the Ukrainians for the near to medium term future. I mean, I don't see in the next 1 to 2 years, unless the Ukrainians were capable of dramatically stepping up their attacks inside Russia with help from the United States, or the United States was willing to put sanctions that would really prevent the Russians from exporting oil. And while those two things have moved a bit in the next few weeks with help from President Trump, not enough that the Russians feel like they need to actually compromise in any way.
And you've said this more than likely will get resolved on the battlefield. Doesn't that put Ukraine at a disadvantage? Where does the fighting stand right now? Who has the advantage?
Yes, it does put the Ukrainians at a disadvantage, and most Ukrainians want to end the war, but they're not prepared to end the war completely on Russian terms, which is what the 28-point plan provided. The Ukrainians are losing territory. They're not losing territory quickly. A lot of civilians are getting killed by Russian targeting, and Ukraine is going to be relying on imports of energy this cold winter season because the Russians have blown up a lot of their electricity and heating capacity. That's where we are. This absolutely is worse for Ukraine and worse for, of course, the Russians fighting the longer it goes on. But you still need a deal that the Ukrainians are capable of accepting. And what the Russians are putting on the table is not meant for the Ukrainians to accept. What Putin is trying to do is to basically split the Americans from the Europeans. He wants to weaken NATO. He doesn't expect that the Ukrainians are going to accept anything he offers. That's not the intention of his negotiating strategy.
All right, Ian Bremmer, thank you.
My pleasure.